Hello and welcome to this new Construct 3 demonstration where I will be explaining the workings of the trajectory calculation. So what we're seeing here is a little demonstration application where there's a player which is the green block here, which can be moved around using the drag drop behavior, and there's two enemies which can also be moved around using the drag drop behavior. And what both enemies do, what they have in common, is they fire projectiles versus towards the player actually. And how this is controlled is using these three sliders here on top. So the left enemy, the red enemy, is controlled using the time of flight slider and the gravity slider. The blue one is controlled using the VX slider and the gravity slider. So it's two different ways of calculating how the trajectories should work, but it actually does the same thing. So let's see how they control the projectiles in the trajectory here. So the time of flight is actually the time it takes for a projectile to come from the enemy towards the player. So if we set it to a higher number, the projectile will be launched at a steeper angle, so it takes longer for the projectile to hit the enemy. If on the other hand this is set to a very low number, it cannot take too much time to get to the player, and the angle at which the projectiles are fired is much lower. So that's what happens here. And then there's the gravity slider, and if we up the gravity slider a bit here, you can see that the angle of the projectile needs to increase as well, because gravity is working on the projectiles more heavily as it increases. And if it decreases, of course, the angle does not have to be that high, because the gravity is much lower and you don't have to shoot that high to end up on the player. So that's what gravity does for you. And then there is this blue enemy, which is not controlled using the time of flight slider, but instead is using the VX slider. The V stands for velocity. It's actually the horizontal velocity, the X velocity. And it's actually, instead of taking time of flight as a given, it's actually calculating the time of flight based on the velocity we're setting here. We're saying you need to go that fast. And then it calculates, okay, what's the time of flight, what the time of flight needs to be of a projectile in order to end up here at the player. And the red object works in the exact opposite way, where the Vx is calculated based on the time of flight. So let's go and look at the code, what happens actually, and we'll see how that exactly works. So this is the code where this first part here takes care of the logic for the red enemy, and this part here takes care of the logic for the blue enemy. But the most important part of the logic here is this one here, apply gravity. So just to make sure you understand, this projectile does not use the physics behavior. It doesn't. Instead, it uses the custom movement behavior. And in that custom movement behavior, you can apply an acceleration to a certain object. And that's what we're doing here when applying gravity. We're just doing that all of the time. On every game loop, we're just applying gravity, and we are accelerating the projectile based on the gravity we're setting in the gravity slider. And we do that, we apply that gravity, we apply the acceleration based on that gravity at an angle of 90 degrees. So as you know, in Construct, 0 degrees means towards the right, 90 degrees means towards the bottom, 270 means up, and stuff like that. So we're going downwards, so we need to apply the acceleration downwards at an angle of 90 degrees. And that's very important, because let's just do an experiment and comment that out and see what the result is. So here is the result. This is without gravity applied. At that time, we just calculate the Vx and the Vy, but the gravity isn't applied to it, so they keep on going into that direction infinitely. So once we go and activate the acceleration again, what will happen is we will calculate a horizontal and a vertical acceleration, a horizontal and a vertical speed rather, and initially the vertical speed will go up, which means that the speed will actually be negative because we're going to go up, because the y coordinate increases from top towards the bottom and it decreases from the bottom towards the top. It means that we have to have a negative y velocity to push the projectile up into the air. And because the acceleration goes the acceleration is applied with a positive number, because the gravity is a positive number, it gradually accelerates towards 0 and then goes above 0, which means that it will accelerate downwards. And that's what happens if we reactivate that and we go into the application again. Then we see that we calculate the correct x, vx and vy, so the horizontal and vertical speed, and it starts off with a little negative speed because it goes up a little bit, and once it hits the tipping point here, the top of the curve, it will have a positive velocity and a positive acceleration, because you see here when moving towards the bottom, the distance between the different projectiles gets larger and larger, because these projectiles that have been moving longer than the ones that have been moving less long are accelerating at a higher rate. That's actually what happens. So the question now is, how do we determine the correct horizontal and vertical velocity? And this is actually done using these calculations here. And let's start with the red enemy. And as you remember, with the red enemy we have two variables we can determine. We have the time of flight, time it takes from the projectile to go from the red enemy towards the player, and we have the gravity, these two are a given. The first thing we do is we calculate the distance of the flight, which is the distance from the x distance, the horizontal distance from the player and to the enemy. And this is what's calculated here. So player x minus enemy red x is the distance of the flight. But we also have to take into account the difference in height of the player and the enemy, because if the enemy is much higher up into the air than the player, it needs to have a higher velocity to reach that player, and vice versa. If the enemy or the player is more below of the enemy doesn't have to fire that hard to hit the enemy, because gravity will take its part. So this is where the launch height comes in. So the first thing we do here is determine the horizontal velocity. And the horizontal velocity basically is the simplest part of the two, because it's actually a speed. It's a velocity, and velocity, as you all know, is a ratio between a distance and a time, kilometers per hour or pixels per second, for example, a distance and a time. And that's what we're doing here, the distance of the flight divided by the time of the flight, so in pixels per second or whatever. And this is Vx. And then the little tricky part becomes here the Vy. And the Vy is a bit of a more complex calculation, which can be seen in two different parts actually. There's this first part here, gravity times time of flight divided by 2, and then we subtract from that the launch height divided by the time of flight. Let's start with this last one here. This is actually the compensation of the velocity for the enemy or the player being higher up or down, more downwards than the enemy or the player. So if it's higher up, that means then the launch height will be a higher number, and we have to divide that by the time of flight to have a velocity, because we're adding velocity to a velocity here. So this is actually velocity which we'll subtract here, and in the end we will negate this entire expression again, because we have to have a negative velocity. All of this will result in a positive number, because gravity times time of flight will be positive, and we will subtract a little bit because we have to compensate for the launch height, and then we make this whole thing negative because we have to fire the projectile up in the air in a negative velocity, and then afterwards the gravity will make that velocity positive gradually. There's a little thing here again which we will see here. Let's see here time of flight divided by 2. You might think, okay, what is that? Well, we don't have to actually go and shoot towards the x value of the variable. You don't have to go that far. You only have to go to about half of the distance, and then gravity will take into account the drop of the projectile, and it will actually drop onto the player at that moment. So what happens here if we don't do that? Let's do a trick here, and let's divide it by 4 instead of 2, and you will see what happens. So you see here where the projectiles end up. They end up about much too short, actually. I'm not going to say it about half of the, but if this were to be exactly at the same height, they would end up exactly at the middle here, because we're not dividing by 2, we're dividing by 4. So we have to take into account that launch height here, because that launch height is not into the equation here. Launch height will be 0, because they will be exactly at the same y coordinate. So if we take that out of the equation and we divide it by 4, we about end up halfway out there. If we were not to divide by anything, so divide by 1, actually we would end up right there, about overshooting it by double. So that's because we only have to fire it in the direction of half of the distance and make the gravity do all of the rest for us. And that's why we actually divide by 2. So that's how Vx and Vy are determined. And then we set the horizontal speed and the vertical speed using the actions of the custom behavior. And we also have to set the gravity of the projectile, so it can be used here to apply the gravity to every single projectile. So the trajectory calculation for the blue enemy is very similar. Actually, the bottom part is exactly the same. Also the Vy calculation, so the difficult part is actually the same. But you'll see that instead of having the time of flight as a given, we will calculate the time of flight. The time of flight being the distance of the flight divided by Vx, and Vx is just the value which we set using the slider. There's one small connotation here. We take into account the position of the player versus the enemy, because by default we will have a positive value from the Vx slider, but it doesn't always, the player is not always to the right of the enemy, of course. And if the player is to the left of the enemy, it needs to multiply it by -1, and that's what we're doing here. We're multiplying by the sine function, and the sine function of where the player is in respect to the blue enemy. And sine is a built-in function which will result in -1 if the value passed as a parameter is negative, or +1 if the value passed as a parameter is positive. So that's what we do here, and then we use this Vx which is given at that time to calculate the time of flight, and then this is used in the Vy calculation, which is the same one as we used for the other enemy. So that's it. That's how the trajectory control works. I hope you liked the video. As always, please like and subscribe, and I will leave a link in the comment section where you can get this template. Thank you for watching.